The morning sun poured gently through the curtains, casting soft light across the living room. The house was quiet, filled with the faint hum of a ceiling fan and the distant sounds of cars on the street. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth. The newspaper lay folded nearby, mostly untouched. It was a peaceful morning, the kind of day that felt ordinary, the kind that made life feel simple and safe. For him, this peace was rare, hard-earned, and deeply cherished. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. People often said he was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but everyone knew him as dependable. He mowed his lawn without complaint, helped neighbors with small tasks, and always greeted people with a nod or a small smile. Yet behind his calm demeanor, there was a depth of discipline and strength few could imagine. Few could guess the life he had left behind, a life filled with danger and demands far beyond anything most people could imagine. On this particular morning, he glanced out the window at the street. Everything seemed normal, but there was an edge in the air, a tension he couldn't place. Sometimes he noticed things others missed. A car parked too long, someone loitering a little too close, a shadow that moved differently. He shrugged it off, telling himself he was being cautious for no reason. After all, most days were ordinary. Ordinary was good. Ordinary was safe. He began his routine, breakfast, checking the mail, tidying up the house. Everything was methodical, precise, yet somehow comforting. He liked routine. It gave structure to life and a sense of control, a feeling that despite the chaos of the world outside, here inside these walls, there was order. His home was his sanctuary, simple and well-kept. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just his life made comfortable by his own hands. But that ordinary morning would not last. A group of people had been moving through the neighborhood in recent weeks, their presence noticeable but often dismissed by others. They were loud, aggressive, and careless, stirring trouble wherever they went. Most people avoided them, crossed the street when they saw them approaching, or hurried inside their homes. They thrived on fear, enjoying the control it gave them over others. They did not expect resistance. They did not expect consequence. And they certainly did not expect someone like him to be living among them, someone who had seen far more than they ever could imagine. He was in the kitchen, wiping the last drops of coffee from his mug when he heard a sudden noise outside. It was a loud crash, followed by a series of breaking sounds that made him freeze mid-motion. The calm of the morning shattered instantly. He dropped the mug carefully to avoid shattering it, the ceramic hitting the counter with a soft thud. Outside, the sound of smashing glass and splintering wood filled the air. He moved to the window, and what he saw made his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a controlled, measured awareness. His house was under attack. A group of men were vandalizing his property, throwing rocks through windows, smashing his front door, and leaving hateful marks on the walls. Graffiti, hateful words, and symbols covered parts of his house. It was clear they wanted to intimidate, to humiliate, to make him feel powerless. He did not panic. Panic was for the untrained, the unprepared. He simply watched, assessing, observing. He could see the group clearly. Young men, brash, confident, thinking their numbers gave them power. They did not know who they were dealing with. They had no idea the man standing behind the glass was not just quiet and ordinary, but a person who had trained for situations far beyond this. Yet he did not move immediately. He let them act, letting their arrogance guide them into underestimating him. His calmness was deliberate. Every second he waited, every movement he made in silence was part of his calculation. He knew that acting in haste could lead to mistakes. Discipline told him patience was strength, that control was power. As the gang continued their destruction, neighbors began to stir. Doors opened, people peeked out windows, some whispered to each other, afraid to confront the vandals directly. The fear was palpable, and he noticed it quietly, like he noticed everything. He understood their fear. They had no idea what they were facing either. They only saw a house being attacked, a man seemingly powerless, but he was far from powerless. He stepped away from the window, moving with a calm efficiency born of years of rigorous training and experience. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and controlled. Inside, he prepared for what might come next. He did not want unnecessary confrontation, but he would not allow his home, his sanctuary, to be violated without response. He understood the difference between fear and respect, between chaos and order, and he was ready to restore the balance if necessary. The gang, meanwhile, continued their rampage, oblivious to the man's history. They laughed and shouted, thinking their aggression gave them dominance. They broke a window on the side of the house and threw furniture onto the lawn. Their voices carried across the street, filled with cruelty and bravado. They did not notice the careful, watchful presence behind the glass, the quiet calculation in the eyes of the man they were provoking. He remembered the life he had left behind. The years of intense training, the missions that tested endurance, courage, and mental strength. He remembered nights filled with danger, challenges that demanded every skill he possessed. That life was behind him, yet it had shaped him completely. It had taught him restraint, the importance of patience, and the power of knowing when to act. And now, faced with this moment, he drew on all that experience without revealing it. He moved quietly through the house, making sure he was safe, ensuring he had options. He considered the gang's likely next moves, anticipating patterns of behavior and weaknesses. He thought like a strategist, not like a victim. His mind worked quickly, assessing, predicting, preparing. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The gang, exhausted from their own chaos, finally began to retreat, thinking they had accomplished their mission. They did not notice the silent, composed figure behind the curtains, the man who could have confronted them at any moment but chose measured observation instead. As they left, leaving destruction behind, he felt no anger, only a deep sense of awareness. He had survived without revealing the extent of his capabilities, keeping control over a situation that many would have panicked in. After the street fell silent, he stepped outside carefully. The damage was extensive, windows shattered, doors splintered, property ruined. Yet he moved deliberately, taking note of every detail. Every mark, every broken piece of wood, every hateful word painted on the walls told him more about the attackers than they could ever understand about him. He was calm, even as neighbors peeked from behind curtains and doors, whispering in awe and fear. He did not speak to them immediately. Words were unnecessary. His presence alone conveyed a quiet authority. People sensed it, though they did not know why. There was something in the way he carried himself, in the calm precision of his movements, that suggested strength beyond ordinary measure. Yet he remained human, approachable, composed, and silent. Inside, he began cleaning what he could, documenting evidence and preparing to restore some semblance of order. He moved with the same discipline he had always carried, refusing to let chaos dictate his actions. His home was more than walls and furniture. It was a place of refuge, a place shaped by patience, effort, and care. He would reclaim it piece by piece without surrendering to fear or anger. That evening, as the sun set, the neighborhood began to understand something they had not before. This was not just a man living quietly among them. There was a depth of character, a presence of strength, and an aura of calm that suggested he was someone not to be underestimated. They did not yet know the full story of who he was, but instinctively, they sensed that the quiet life he led was not weakness, it was control, restraint, and an unspoken power. He sat back in his favorite chair, looking at the damage, thinking about the day's events. He reflected on the balance between peace and action, between patience and decisiveness. He understood that his life had prepared him for moments like this, and though today had been a test of calm observation, it was only the beginning. There was more to come, but he would meet it on his own terms, with discipline, intelligence, and the quiet force that had defined his life. For now, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had observed, assessed, and survived without unnecessary conflict. He had maintained control over a chaotic situation and ensured that he was ready for whatever might follow. In that quiet moment, he felt the strength that came from preparation, patience, and experience. The world outside could be violent and unpredictable, but inside he remained steady, composed, and ready. And in that steadiness he found his true power, not in anger, not in revenge, but in calm, measured presence, the kind that could turn fear into respect, chaos into order, and danger into control. The morning after the attack, the man woke with the same calm he always carried. Though the events of the previous day weighed heavily on his mind, he moved through his home with quiet efficiency, assessing every corner, checking each window and door. Nothing went unnoticed. The destruction left behind by the gang was more than physical, it was personal. They wanted to send a message to make him feel small, vulnerable, exposed. But he did not allow that. Vulnerability was a choice, and he chose control instead. As he walked through the house, he remembered the feeling of broken glass under his feet, the anger in the gang members' shouts, and the chaos of the moment. Most people would have panicked, called the police immediately, maybe even considered leaving their home. But for him, panic was unnecessary. The world had taught him lessons far more intense than this. He had learned to read people, anticipate danger, and move with precision under pressure. Those lessons were now tools ready to be used. He opened a notebook he kept for situations like this. It was simple, unassuming, but inside it contained careful notes, observations, and reminders. He wrote down everything he had noticed the day before. The gang's numbers, their movements, the sounds they made, the speed at which they acted. Even small details mattered. The way someone stood, the way they spoke, the careless confidence in their actions. All of it could be used to predict their next move. Though he wrote, he did not allow his thoughts to turn toward anger. Anger was temporary and clouded judgment. He thought instead about strategy. He considered his options, weighing them carefully. He could call the police, but that would not prevent them from returning, and it would not teach them respect. He could confront them immediately, but rash action would give them the advantage, playing into their expectation that violence could dominate any situation. No, he needed a different approach. He needed control. After finishing his notes, he stepped outside to inspect the yard. Broken branches, shattered glass, and spray-painted walls greeted him. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and doors, whispering nervously among themselves. Some approached cautiously, offering help, others merely watched. They had seen what had happened, but they did not know who he truly was. He smiled slightly at the thought. They were seeing only the surface. They could not see the strength beneath, the life experience, the skill and discipline that had shaped him into someone who could handle far greater threats than this. He began the process of cleaning and repairing what he could. It was not just about restoring the house, it was about reclaiming his space, reasserting control. He moved methodically, breaking the work into small, manageable tasks. He swept glass carefully, removed debris, and patched damaged walls where possible. Each action was deliberate, controlled, like a meditation. The physical work helped him focus, and the slow, steady rhythm reminded him that while chaos existed outside, order could always be restored. As he worked, he thought more about the gang. They had come into his life uninvited, believing they could intimidate him. They were reckless, careless, arrogant, but they were predictable, and predictability could be a weapon. He recalled his training, not just in combat, but in observation, strategy, and discipline. Years of experience had taught him to notice things others would overlook: body language, hesitation, overconfidence, and patterns of behavior. These were tools. These were opportunities. By midday, he had repaired what he could and secured the house. New locks, reinforced windows, and subtle traps of security were put in place, not to harm, but to protect. He was careful not to act rashly. Every step was planned, every move deliberate. There was no need to escalate yet. The gang's ignorance of his true identity worked in his favor, giving him the advantage of surprise. They assumed they were dealing with someone ordinary, someone who would respond like everyone else. They could not be more wrong. Late in the afternoon, he decided to leave the house briefly, moving through the neighborhood with calm observation. He watched the gang from a distance, noting their routines, how they interacted, and the paths they took when moving through the streets. They were loud, careless, confident in their perceived power. He did not approach them yet. He did not need confrontation to assert authority. Patience was a stronger weapon than immediate action. During his walk, a neighbor approached him cautiously, speaking in hushed tones about fear and safety. He listened calmly, offering gentle reassurance without revealing the depth of his own experience. The neighbor spoke of rumors, about how the gang had terrorized other streets and how people felt powerless. He nodded, understanding the concern, but inside he was already planning. Fear, when handled correctly, could be transformed into control and respect. He had seen it many times before. Returning home, he spent time reviewing security footage from the few cameras he had installed. The images showed the gang in action, their confidence evident, their mistakes apparent. Each misstep was an opportunity to understand them, to predict future actions. He noted their leader, the man most aggressive, most reckless. He observed patterns, times they moved, the way they looked over their shoulders, the way they relied on numbers rather than skill. All of it was useful. That night, he sat in the living room with only the soft hum of the fan and the occasional car outside. The house was quiet again, but it felt different. It was no longer just a home. It was a place of preparation, of strategy, a sanctuary where he had control over what unfolded next. He reflected on his life, on the skills he had honed over years of intense training. Those skills were not something he had shown in everyday life. He had lived quietly, peacefully, blending into the neighborhood, never revealing the danger that had shaped him. But those years of discipline, of preparation, were now quietly aligning with the situation at hand. He thought about the gang again, about the arrogance that came from ignorance. They assumed strength was loud, violent, and uncontrolled. They did not understand that real strength often came quietly, patiently, from someone who could wait, observe, and act with precision. He knew that when the time came, he could act decisively, but it would not be without planning. There was no need for unnecessary risk. Patience gave him advantage, and advantage gave him power. In the early hours of the next day, he began small protective measures around his home. He adjusted locks, set cameras in discreet locations, and reinforced entry points. He was careful to remain unnoticed, to avoid alerting the gang that their actions had consequences. Every action was subtle yet strategic. Even in the simplest of movements, there was a precision that most people could not comprehend. He was preparing not just for defense, but for the eventual moment when the gang would realize they had underestimated him. Despite the seriousness of the situation, he remained human, grounded in reality. He took breaks, drank coffee, and listened to music softly. He allowed himself brief moments of normalcy. It was not just discipline that defined him, but also the ability to maintain humanity amidst chaos. He understood that rage or overreaction would weaken him. Calm, patience, and clarity of thought were far more effective. As the week went on, he continued observing. The gang occasionally returned, sometimes to taunt, sometimes to check if he would react. Each time he noted details, patterns, weaknesses. They believed their presence instilled fear, but he remained calm, letting them act under the illusion of control. He was always ready, always observing and always learning. Each move they made, each step they took became part of a map in his mind, a plan forming silently but steadily. Neighbors began to notice a subtle change. The man who had always been quiet now carried an air of confidence, a calm presence that suggested control without aggression. Some whispered, others watched in awe. They did not yet know why, but instinctively they sensed the difference. Fear was shifting, respect slowly replacing it. He was not just a victim or a passive observer. He was someone who understood danger, someone who could navigate it, and someone who could act when necessary. By the end of the week, the gang had made several small attempts to intimidate, but each time they were met with subtle resistance. Security cameras caught their movements, locked doors and reinforced windows prevented damage, and the man's calculated measures made it clear that their usual tactics would not work. They began to grow uneasy, unsure why their efforts had so little effect. The confidence that had fueled them began to waver, replaced by caution and confusion. He watched quietly from inside his home, a figure of calm amidst a neighborhood filled with whispered concern. He had not yet revealed the full extent of his abilities, nor would he until necessary. Control was his ally, patience his weapon, and observation his guide. He understood the power of restraint and the importance of choosing the right moment to act decisively. The gang had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated him, and he knew when the time came they would understand. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as the man sat in his living room. The house, once battered by the gang's attack, now stood firm, secured, and calm. Outside, the streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the lawns. He could feel the tension in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, like a quiet warning that something bigger was about to unfold. He had observed enough to know that the gang would not stop until they understood who they were dealing with, and he was ready for them. He leaned back in his chair, letting his mind wander briefly to the life he had left behind. For years, he had lived in danger, in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Every day, every mission had honed his skills that went far beyond the ordinary. Precision, patience, observation, strategy, and discipline were not just words. They were survival tools. And now, in his quiet neighborhood, Those tools were quietly coming back into play. He recalled the rigorous training, the long nights in harsh conditions, the physical and mental endurance tests that had shaped him. There had been times when exhaustion threatened to take over, when danger was immediate and overwhelming, but he had survived. He had learned to remain calm, even when chaos surrounded him, to act decisively yet without unnecessary aggression, to control both his body and his mind. Those lessons were invaluable now. It was time to consider a plan. The gang had shown their nature. They were reckless, arrogant, and predictable in their patterns. They thrived on fear, on intimidation, believing that chaos could bend others to their will. But he understood them, perhaps better than they understood themselves. Their mistakes were already visible: overconfidence, carelessness, and a belief that no one in the neighborhood could stand up to them. He intended to use every one of those mistakes against them. He began quietly documenting their movements. Over the past few days, he had observed their routines, noting times when they appeared in the neighborhood, their usual hangouts, and their leaders' gestures and decisions. These details, though small, formed a map in his mind. Every predictable action became a potential advantage. Even the way they spoke, the laughter that often followed threats, and the careless glances they threw around. All of it was data. And in his mind, data was power. Yet despite his knowledge, he remained calm. He knew he could act immediately, that his experience gave him abilities far beyond the gang's comprehension. But acting hastily could create mistakes, could escalate violence unnecessarily. He had learned the value of patience. The right moment, chosen with precision, could be far more powerful than any rash retaliation. He had survived entire operations in life-threatening situations by waiting, observing, and then acting at exactly the right time. This would be no different. During the day, he took small but significant measures. He reinforced the remaining weak points in his home, set up additional cameras discreetly, and arranged his property to serve both as protection and as a way to monitor intruders. Every decision was deliberate, and he maintained a calm exterior so that anyone observing from a distance would see only an ordinary man taking precautions. The key was to remain underestimated. The gang needed to believe that he was ordinary, unaware, and vulnerable. Their ignorance would be their downfall. In the late afternoon, he went for a walk around the neighborhood. From a distance, he observed the gang moving casually, laughing among themselves, assuming that their previous attacks had succeeded in intimidating him. They did not notice him, blending into his surroundings as he had planned. As he watched, he noted their body language, how the leader gestured, how members responded to threats, and how easily they could be distracted. Patterns began to emerge, subtle but consistent, offering him insight into how they might act next. Back in his home, he reflected further on his past experiences. He remembered missions where being invisible, unnoticed, or underestimated had been the difference between life and death. A moment of stillness, a pause to observe, or a small deliberate action could change the outcome entirely. Those experiences had taught him restraint but also readiness, the balance between patience and decisiveness. That balance was now the principle guiding him. As night fell, he reviewed his notes again, planning the next steps carefully. The gang's attacks had escalated in intensity, and it was clear they were growing bolder. He did not underestimate their recklessness. He respected their unpredictability, but he also knew that overconfidence was often a weakness. He could see it in their movements, in the way they laughed too loudly, in the careless gestures that betrayed inexperience despite their apparent confidence. Each weakness was a piece of the larger strategy forming in his mind. He began to prepare subtle defensive measures that would make the gang question their advantage without revealing his own skills. Reinforced locks, secure perimeter points, and strategically positioned cameras created a sense of preparedness. At the same time, he considered the psychological aspect, making the gang doubt themselves, planting uncertainty that could slow or even stop their attacks. He knew fear, when introduced strategically, could be far more effective than confrontation. As the evening grew darker, he took a moment to sit quietly and reflect. The neighborhood was still asleep, unaware of the careful preparation taking place behind closed doors. He thought about the balance of power and the responsibility that came with skill. His abilities could be dangerous if misused, but restraint and careful action ensured that he maintained control without unnecessary harm. He understood that true power was often quiet, invisible, and precise. During the night, faint noises occasionally broke the silence, and he moved silently to observe. Shadows crossed the street, cars drove slowly by, and he noted each sound carefully. These were small movements, easy to ignore, but nothing escaped his attention. Years of experience had trained him to detect details that others overlooked. Every movement in the dark became part of a larger pattern. Another piece of the information he could use to maintain control. The gang, unaware of his observation, continued their routine, believing they were untouchable. They did not suspect that the man they had tried to intimidate was not only watching, but also planning and preparing in ways they could never imagine. Their confidence, rooted in ignorance, made them predictable. Their arrogance created openings. Every mistake they made was recorded mentally, catalogued, and stored for the moment when action would be necessary. By midweek, he had developed a subtle plan that combined observation, strategic preparation, and psychological awareness. He would not confront the gang immediately, but he was ready to act when the time was right. He knew that precision, timing, and restraint were more effective than uncontrolled aggression. The neighborhood, though still fearful, began to sense a change. There was a quiet strength in the way he moved, a calm assurance that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. He spent his days preparing in small, deliberate ways, reinforcing windows, checking the security system, noting every approach the gang took, and predicting their likely movements. Each action was quiet, almost invisible, yet crucial. He did not want to draw attention to himself. The effectiveness of his plan depended on maintaining the illusion of normalcy, on letting the gang believe they had the upper hand. Their misjudgment would be decisive. Throughout this time, he reflected on the importance of patience and strategic thought. He had survived extreme situations because he understood that action without thought was dangerous. Observation, preparation, and timing were far more powerful than anger or impulsive retaliation. He was not preparing for revenge, he was preparing for control, for protection, and for the eventual moment when the gang would see the consequences of underestimating him. Night after night, he practiced mental exercises, reviewing every detail, imagining potential scenarios, and considering every possible outcome. His skills were being honed even without physical confrontation. He moved through his home silently, ready for any intrusion, but always calm, never reckless. He understood that real power came from clarity, patience, and readiness rather than impulsive aggression. Finally, after days of observation and preparation, he felt ready to take the next step. The gang had exposed themselves enough, shown enough patterns and weaknesses, and revealed their overconfidence. The moment had arrived to shift from observation to subtle action. He did not rush, but he understood that the balance between patience and decisiveness had tipped. Control would now be asserted in ways that were measured, precise, and effective. He spent the next hours finalizing his preparations, arranging his home and property in ways that would allow him to act if necessary, and considering psychological tactics to make the gang doubt their perceived advantage. Each decision was deliberate, every detail carefully considered. He had studied their weaknesses and understood their patterns. The stage was set and he was ready. As the night deepened, he sat quietly, waiting. The street outside remained dark and still, but he knew the gang would soon make their next move. When they did, he would be ready, not with uncontrolled violence, but with calculated precision, using skill, strategy, and intelligence to restore balance. For the first time since the initial attack, he allowed himself a small sense of anticipation. The moment of action was approaching, and he would meet it on his own terms. This was not about anger. This was not about revenge. This was about control, protection, and the assertion of quiet, unspoken power. He had prepared, observed, and planned. The gang believed they understood the situation, but they had underestimated the man behind the quiet facade. They had no idea that the calm, ordinary neighbor they had tried to intimidate was someone capable of far more than they could imagine. And when the time came, they would realize their mistake. The following evening was quiet at first, but he knew the gang would soon make their next move. From past observation, he could predict their behavior, reckless, confident, testing boundaries, unaware that every step they took was being watched. He moved silently through his home, checking every entrance, ensuring that every lock, camera, and reinforcement was in place. His movements were calm and deliberate, a contrast to the chaos the gang thrived on. As night fell, he could see the first signs of their approach. Shadows shifted across the street and faint voices echoed through the neighborhood. The gang was back, likely thinking that a subtle intimidation attempt would yield a reaction. But tonight would be different. Tonight he would show that patience, observation, and preparation were far more powerful than fear or aggression. He remained inside, unseen, observing from a distance. The gang laughed loudly, taunting the empty house, tossing small objects against the walls and windows. Their confidence was still high, but cracks were beginning to appear. They moved carelessly, splitting up to explore the property, revealing patterns in their behavior he could exploit. His mind worked quickly, calculating, predicting, planning. Every detail was critical, every movement a clue. He chose not to confront them directly yet. The goal was not to destroy them immediately, but to destabilize them. He began with subtle measures, turning lights on and off in different rooms, creating shadows, and using reflections to make the house seem occupied and alert. Small, almost imperceptible sounds were amplified by careful placement of objects, giving the impression that someone was moving around the house. Psychological tactics were as important as physical preparation, and he used them expertly. The gang hesitated, unsure why the house seemed more alive than before. Whispers and nervous laughter replaced their usual confidence. They moved cautiously, glancing over their shoulders, sensing something but unable to identify it. Their overconfidence, previously a strength, had become a weakness. Patience and subtle action had shifted the balance of power without any physical confrontation. He continued observing, noting each member's reactions. The leader, who had been the most aggressive, began showing signs of doubt. The gang's morale wavered as uncertainty took hold. He knew that by planting hesitation and fear, he had already gained an advantage. The gang had relied on intimidation, but now, without realizing it, they were being intimidated themselves. As the night progressed, he made small, strategic moves to test their awareness. A door creaked softly. A shadow moved in a corner, a floorboard groaned under slight weight. Each action was controlled, deliberate, and designed to create tension without revealing his full capability. The gang reacted, splitting up further, revealing more weaknesses. He noted every movement, storing the information for the moment when he would act decisively. Meanwhile, neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering anxiously. Some had called the police in the past, but now they saw the gang hesitating, unsure, even afraid. The man remained calm, human in his demeanor, but formidable in his presence. He did not raise his voice, he did not rush, yet his control over the situation was absolute. His quiet strength was evident, though unseen by most. By late night, he had created enough uncertainty to force the gang to retreat temporarily. They left, mumbling among themselves, confused and unnerved. Their arrogance had led them into a situation they did not understand, and his careful, measured actions had turned the tables without confrontation. For him, it was a small victory, but an important one. Control, once established, could be expanded gradually. The following days were spent in continued preparation. He reinforced his home further, installing additional security measures and repositioning cameras to cover all angles. Each adjustment was subtle, almost invisible, but enhanced his readiness. He also continued studying the gang's routines, noting predictable patterns and weaknesses. Patience remained his ally, allowing him to gather information and prepare for future encounters. He reflected on the psychology of fear. True fear was not loud or chaotic, it was quiet, subtle, and strategic. By creating uncertainty and doubt, he could achieve results far greater than through confrontation alone. The gang's own arrogance had become their weakness, and he was exploiting it expertly. His actions were precise, measured, and deliberate, ensuring that he maintained the moral high ground while asserting control. One evening, as he reviewed footage of the gang from a distance, he noticed a new development. They were attempting to intimidate other neighbors, likely testing their confidence before returning to him. He made a decision. Rather than responding with violence, he used his skills to intervene discreetly, creating subtle obstacles that slowed their movements and revealed their vulnerabilities. Items were strategically moved, lights timed to startle, sounds manipulated to create confusion. Small actions but effective. The gang's reaction was immediate. They became cautious, hesitant, and increasingly paranoid. Their bravado faltered as they realized the neighborhood was no longer passive. Though they did not know who was behind it, They began to sense that they had underestimated someone. Their patterns became more erratic, their confidence diminishing. He continued to observe, patient, precise, and ready. During the day, he also reached out quietly to a few trusted neighbors, giving subtle guidance on safety without revealing his capabilities. He helped them secure windows, reinforced doors, and advised on simple precautionary measures. His approach was careful, human, and protective. He did not want to frighten anyone unnecessarily, only to empower them. This reinforced his role as a calm, capable presence in the neighborhood, a silent guardian whose true strength remained unseen. As the week progressed, he noted that the gang's attacks had become less organized. Their previous confidence had eroded, replaced by uncertainty. They were beginning to fear the unknown force that observed them, reacted subtly, and remained calm under pressure. He continued his strategy, allowing them to expose more weaknesses while maintaining his own invisibility. By acting indirectly, he could control the situation without creating unnecessary harm or drawing unwanted attention. One night, the gang attempted a more aggressive approach. They approached the house in larger numbers, confident that intimidation alone would yield results. But he was ready. Inside, he had prepared the property strategically. Doors secured, cameras positioned, paths monitored. Small noises and subtle movements amplified their perception of the environment. Shadows seemed to move unexpectedly. Lights flickered, and the sense of presence was overwhelming. The gang hesitated, whispering among themselves, unsure what was happening. Their confidence faltered, replaced by confusion and fear. They split up, some attempting to circle the property, others trying to retreat. He did not intervene directly yet, letting their mistakes accumulate, studying each reaction carefully. Each member's behavior added to his understanding, giving him insight into how to manage future encounters more effectively. By midnight, the gang retreated again, leaving the neighborhood in silence. They were shaken, uncertain, and less bold than before. His subtle measures had worked perfectly. Without confrontation, he had shifted the balance of power, turning fear back on those who had tried to create it. Neighbors sensed the change, quietly relieved but still unaware of the depth of his abilities. For him, the week had reinforced important lessons. Patience, observation, and subtlety were powerful tools. Direct confrontation was unnecessary when strategy could achieve the same results with minimal risk. The gang had underestimated him repeatedly, and each misjudgment strengthened his position. He had created a psychological advantage, turning the aggressor's arrogance into their weakness. He spent the following days preparing for the possibility of a final confrontation, though he hoped it could still be avoided. Every measure was calculated: backup plans, escape routes, and monitoring strategies. He understood the importance of readiness without overreaction. Control, he knew, was not about winning every immediate battle, but about maintaining the upper hand through preparation, observation, and careful action. In quiet moments, he reflected on his role in the neighborhood. He was human, approachable, and calm, but he carried skills and experience that gave him strength beyond measure. He understood the difference between power and violence, control and chaos. By maintaining patience, precision, and presence, he could protect himself and others while remaining morally grounded. His approach was measured, intelligent, and humane, a reflection of both his experience and character. As Part 4 came to a close, the stage was set. The gang had been destabilized, their confidence shaken, and their patterns exposed. The neighborhood had regained a sense of safety, though quietly, and the man remained vigilant, calm, and prepared. He had demonstrated that patience, strategy, and subtlety could be more powerful than aggression, and that true strength was often invisible until revealed with precision. The story was far from over. The gang still lingered, still underestimated him, and the next moves would be decisive. But he was ready, patient, disciplined, and fully aware of the advantage that careful planning and skill could provide. The next chapter would not rely on fear alone but on action, measured, deliberate, and controlled. And when that moment arrived, the balance of power would shift entirely. The night was heavy, still, and quiet, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. He sat in his living room, calm, focused, and alert. Outside, the neighborhood lay in silence, the streetlights casting long shadows across lawns and pavement. He knew the gang would not stay away forever. Their arrogance, their need to assert power, would bring them back. And when they returned, he would be ready, not in anger, but in control. For days he had observed, prepared, and subtly weakened their confidence. He had turned fear back onto them, made their bravado falter, and studied every mistake they had made. Now it was time for the final act. He would not act recklessly. Every move had been planned, every contingency considered. He understood that true strength lay not in aggression but in patience, intelligence, and precision. The first sounds came as faint footsteps on the sidewalk. Then the voices, low and careless at first, grew louder. The gang had returned, confident that this time they would assert dominance. They were unaware of how much they had underestimated him. Each step they took toward his home was measured in his mind, every gesture noted, every movement predicting the next. He did not panic. He never panicked. Calmness was his greatest weapon. Inside, he moved quietly, positioning himself strategically. The house was prepared, doors reinforced, cameras recording, paths controlled. He had not set traps to harm unnecessarily, only to protect, to guide, and to control. He understood that this confrontation was not about violence for its own sake. It was about reclaiming his space, asserting control, and showing that recklessness could not triumph over discipline and intelligence. The gang reached the front yard, shouting and laughing, attempting to provoke him. They smashed small objects against the porch and banged on doors. But this time their tactics faltered. Lights flickered unexpectedly, shadows shifted in ways they could not anticipate, and quiet sounds seemed to come from nowhere. Their confidence wavered as hesitation took root. Each member looked to the others, uncertainty spreading. The leader, previously the most aggressive, began to falter, unsure whether they had been outmatched by someone invisible. He did not step outside yet. Instead, he allowed their doubt to grow, guiding them with subtle psychological cues. He moved quietly in the house, adjusting lights, opening and closing doors, making the house seem alive and alert. The gang split up, some moving around the yard, others retreating. Their arrogance had been stripped away by uncertainty. They were beginning to realize that the man they had tried to intimidate was no ordinary neighbor. As he watched, he thought back to his years of training. He had learned to act decisively when the moment demanded it. He had learned that timing, precision, and control were far more important than brute strength or chaos. Those lessons now guided his every action. He was not rushing. He was choosing the perfect moment to assert control fully and reclaim what was rightfully his. The leader stepped forward, trying to assert authority despite the uncertainty. "Where are you? Show yourself!" he shouted, voice trembling slightly. The other members echoed the demand, trying to regain confidence, but their fear was growing. They could not see him, could not anticipate his position. The invisible force controlling the situation had taken complete command. He moved silently to a window overlooking the yard, positioning himself to make his presence known without unnecessary confrontation. His eyes were calm, steady, and focused. Every muscle, every instinct trained over years of discipline was ready. He did not need to raise his voice or act aggressively to command attention. His presence alone was enough. Then with a quiet, deliberate movement, he stepped into view. The gang froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. They had expected an ordinary man, someone easy to intimidate. Instead, they saw someone composed, confident, and fully in control. His gaze alone conveyed authority, and the silence of the moment amplified the effect. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. It carried across the yard, steady and unyielding. The gang flinched, unsure whether to laugh or retreat. But the calm confidence in his tone left no room for mockery. This was not a threat born of anger. It was command born of skill and experience. The leader of the gang tried to respond, to regain control, but hesitation had taken root. The group looked to each other, seeking guidance, realizing too late that their confidence had been their downfall. Their numbers and noise could not overcome precision, patience, and intelligence. They had underestimated the wrong man. He continued, speaking clearly and deliberately, guiding them without unnecessary aggression. "This ends now. You will leave this neighborhood and never return. If you don't, there will be consequences you cannot imagine." His words were calm, measured, but carried a weight that silenced even the bravest among them. The gang members looked at one another, fear and confusion spreading. Their usual tactics of intimidation, shouting, and reckless violence had failed repeatedly. They now understood that this man was far beyond what they had anticipated. They had provoked someone who was not only prepared but disciplined, patient, and fully aware of every move they had made. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to retreat. Some moved toward the street, others toward their vehicles, still casting nervous glances toward the house. The leader lingered, trying to maintain a facade of control, but even he could not hide the realization that they had lost. Their arrogance had been dismantled by calm observation, subtle action, and precision. He watched them leave, making sure they fully exited the neighborhood before allowing himself to relax. His eyes remained alert, his mind fully present. The threat had been neutralized, not through reckless violence, but through strategy, preparation, and calm authority. The balance of power had shifted, and the neighborhood was safe once more. After the gang disappeared, he walked slowly through his home, checking windows and doors again. He documented the aftermath, noting the damage and the changes that would need to be made. But beyond that, he allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. He had restored control, defended his home, and ensured that the aggressors understood the consequences of underestimating him. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, cautiously at first, then with growing curiosity. They had heard some of the shouting and seen shadows moving, but they did not yet know the full extent of what had happened. When they saw him, calm, composed, and in control, there was a quiet recognition of something extraordinary. They did not know the details, but instinctively, they sensed that the man who had lived quietly among them was far from ordinary. He spoke to a few neighbors, reassuring them gently without revealing his full capabilities. His focus remained on protection, calm guidance, and the restoration of safety. He had no desire to boast or create fear. His actions spoke for themselves. The quiet confidence and steady presence he carried were more powerful than any words could convey. In the days following the final confrontation, the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The gang had been forced to retreat, their confidence shattered, their presence no longer a threat. People whispered about the calm, capable man who had defended his home without reckless violence, transforming fear into a lesson in discipline and control. He remained quiet, unassuming, and grounded, showing that true strength often went unnoticed until revealed with precision. He reflected on the events with a sense of clarity. Patience, observation, and preparation had been more powerful than any immediate act of aggression. His skills, honed over years of experience, had been used not for anger or revenge, but for protection, control, and the restoration of balance. He had proven to himself, and to those who had underestimated him, that intelligence and discipline could triumph over recklessness and arrogance. The neighborhood slowly regained confidence, and people began to feel safe again. They respected him not out of fear, but because they sensed the calm authority he carried. He did not seek recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had acted wisely and effectively. His home, once attacked and violated, now stood secure, a testament to his preparation and control. In the end, he returned to his daily routines, calm and composed as ever. Coffee in the morning, quiet walks, tending to his home and observing the world around him. The events of the past weeks had reinforced his understanding that real power lay in patience, strategy, and controlled action. He had confronted danger with precision, protected his home and neighbors, and restored order without unnecessary chaos. And though the neighborhood would never fully know the extent of his skills or experience, the quiet respect he inspired was enough. The gang had learned their lesson. They had underestimated a man who lived quietly among them, someone who could have acted recklessly but chose intelligence, patience, and restraint. That choice had ensured their defeat and the safety of the community. For him, life returned to its natural rhythm. But beneath the calm surface, he remained vigilant, prepared, and aware. The past had taught him the importance of readiness, observation, and careful action. And though the threat had passed for now, he knew that patience, preparation, and quiet strength would always be his greatest allies. He had faced chaos and intimidation, and emerged not only unscathed, but victorious. His home, his peace, and his dignity were,